You are watching an empire collapse. You are inside of it right now, and I can prove it in under 60 seconds. Every empire in the last 500 years has collapsed in the same 7 stages. Military overextension, currency debasement, a debt spiral, loss of productive capacity, social decay, loss of reserve currency status, and then the fall. Spain followed the pattern. Bankrupt 4 times, gone. Britain followed the pattern. From ruling a quarter of the earth to rationing bread in a decade, gone. The Soviet Union followed the pattern. Dissolved in 900 days, gone. The United States has completed 5 of those 7 stages. The 6th has already started. The dollar's share of global reserves has dropped from 73% to 54%. China slashed its treasury holdings by 45%. BRICS is building payment systems to replace the dollar entirely. And the war we just started is costing $2 billion a day. Borrowed at the highest interest rates in 20 years, stacked on top of $39 trillion in debt, while 722 banks are sitting on losses that exceed half their capital, and the Treasury Department has declared the government insolvent by its own accounting. Every empire that reached this point believed it was different, that its military was too strong, that its economy was too advanced, that the rules did not apply to them. They were all wrong, and nobody told their citizens what was happening until it was too late. I am telling you right now. Let's get into it. Number 10. Every empire in history has collapsed in the same 7 stages, and America just entered stage 5. I need you to hear something that is going to reframe everything you think you know about what is happening in this country right now. There is a pattern, not a theory, not a guess. A documented, repeatable, verifiable pattern that has played out across every single dominant empire in the last 500 years of recorded history. And the United States is currently deep inside of it. A British military officer and historian named Sir John Bagod Glubb spent his career studying the life cycles of empires, and what he found is that they all follow 7 stages in the same order with almost no variation. Stage 1 is military overextension, expanding global commitments beyond what the economy can sustain. Stage 2 is currency debasement, inflating or weakening the currency to fund spending that tax revenue cannot cover. Stage 3 is a debt spiral, borrowing to service previous debt until interest costs explode. Stage 4 is the loss of productive capacity, the decline of domestic manufacturing and real economic output. Stage 5 is social decay, rising internal dysfunction, falling trust, demographic collapse, and institutional failure. Stage 6 is the loss of reserve currency status, and Stage 7 is the sudden collapse itself. Spain followed this pattern between 1590 and 1670. In the 1500s, Spain was the richest empire on earth, controlling half the world's gold and silver reserves. Their military dominated Europe. Their currency was accepted everywhere. Within 80 years, they had declared bankruptcy 4 times. Their domestic industry had collapsed because easy wealth from the Americas destroyed productive discipline, and they fell into irrelevance as a world power. Britain followed the same pattern between 1914 and 1954. At its peak, the sun never set on the British Empire. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. They controlled a quarter of the Earth's surface. But 2 world wars drained the treasury. The wealth gap widened until the top 1% owned over 70% of all wealth. The military became overextended across too many theaters, and the pound lost its reserve currency status at Bretton Woods in 1944, when the dollar replaced it. Within 3 decades of the warning signs appearing, the entire empire was gone. The Soviet Union followed the pattern at an even faster pace. Massive military spending consumed 15 to 20% of GDP. The economy stagnated under central planning. The ruble was not trusted internationally. The oil price collapse of the 1980s wrecked their finances. They lost Eastern Europe in 1989, and the entire Union dissolved within 900 days. Yale historian Paul Kennedy wrote about this in his landmark 1987 book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, and his core argument was that empires face an unavoidable tension between military spending and productive investment, and when military costs spiral upward, as they always do, because each generation of weapons costs more than the last, less money is available for the things that actually generate wealth. Now apply that framework to the United States in 2026. Stage 1, military overextension. The Department of Defense budget for fiscal year 2026 is $892 billion, the largest on Earth, with a proposed increase to $1.5 trillion. The U.S. maintains more than 750 military bases in over 80 countries. We are simultaneously engaged in deterrence operations against China, Russia, and Iran, while fighting an active war in the Middle East. Stage 2, currency debasement. The dollar has lost approximately 98% of its purchasing power since the gold standard ended in 1971. Stage 3. Debt spiral. The national debt just crossed $39 trillion, and interest payments alone are approaching $1 trillion per year. Stage 4. Loss of productive capacity. America's manufacturing base has been hollowed out by decades of offshoring, and the trade deficit has been persistently negative for 50 years. Stage 5 is where we are right now. Social decay. Falling trust in every institution. Record loneliness. Record deaths of despair. A generation priced out of housing, unable to start families, carrying $18.8 trillion in household debt. Every single one of those markers matches the pattern. And the University of Washington's Economic Society published an analysis noting that the United States approaches its 250th anniversary in 2026, and that no one alive today has experienced a world without American global dominance. That is about to change, because every empire that reached stage 5 proceeded to stage 6, and the signs of stage 6 are already emerging. Number 9. The dollar is losing its grip on the world, and the Iran war just accelerated it by a decade. All right, this is the one that should genuinely scare you, because everything else on this list, the debt, the infrastructure, the housing crisis, the retirement disaster, all of that is painful, but it is manageable, as long as one thing remains true. As long as the United States dollar remains the world's reserve currency, because reserve currency status is the single most powerful economic advantage any nation can have. It means the entire world needs your money to do business. It means you can borrow at lower rates than anyone else because there is always demand for your debt. It means you can print money to fund your deficits, and the rest of the world absorbs the inflation for you. It is the golden ticket, and the United States has held that ticket since 1944. But that ticket is being torn up in real time, and the Iran war just ripped it in half. Here is what is happening right now, that almost nobody in mainstream media is explaining to you. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has fallen from 73% in 2001 to approximately 54% in 2025, according to IMF data. That is a 19-point decline in 24 years. China has slashed its U.S. Treasury holdings by more than 45% from their peak. In 2013, China held $1.3 trillion in U.S. Treasuries. By mid-2025, that number had dropped to $730 billion. And China's foreign exchange reserves shifted from holding 40% of their reserves in dollar-denominated treasuries around 2010 to less than 1% by 2025, according to analysis of OFAC sanctions data. They are not just reducing, they are evacuating. And they are replacing dollars with gold. Central banks around the world have been purchasing over 1,000 tons of gold annually since 2022. China's central bank bought gold for 11 consecutive months through September 2025. J.P. Morgan reported that gold in emerging market reserves has more than doubled from 4% to 9% in the last decade, and they forecast gold prices climbing toward $4,000 per ounce by mid-2026. Foreign ownership of the U.S. Treasury market has fallen from above 50% during the financial crisis to just 30% as of early 2025. That decline is not a blip, it is a structural shift, and the Iran war poured jet fuel on it. Iran is now charging yuan-denominated tolls at the Strait of Hormuz. Indian refiners are settling Russian crude in yuan and dirhams instead of dollars. Saudi Arabia, which was historically Washington's most critical Middle Eastern ally, now sits within BRICS and participates in the Bridge Cross-Border Settlement Platform. BRICS, which now includes 11 nations representing nearly 40% of global GDP by purchasing power parity, is building alternative payment infrastructure specifically designed to bypass the dollar-based SWIFT system. And 90% of Russia's trade within BRICS is now conducted in local currencies. The petrodollar system, which has been the backbone of American financial hegemony since 1974, is facing what analysts are calling its most credible stress test in decades. Now, here is why this matters to you personally. When the world needs fewer dollars, demand for U.S. government debt falls. When demand for government debt falls, the government has to pay higher interest rates to attract buyers. When interest rates rise, your mortgage gets more expensive, your car loan gets more expensive, your credit card rate goes up, and the government's own interest payments explode, which means more borrowing, which means more money printing, which means more inflation, eating away at every dollar you have saved. J.P. Morgan acknowledged that while the dollar still clears 58% of global trade and 89% of forex volume, the erosion is real and incremental. Every empire that lost its reserve currency status, every single one experienced a dramatic decline in living standards within a generation. Britain went from ruling a quarter of the planet to rationing bread and butter within 10 years of losing reserve currency status. And an analysis published this month noted that the US has now completed 5 of the 7 stages of imperial collapse and is showing clear early signs of stage 6, which is loss of reserve currency status. The pattern has held for 500 years across every empire that has risen and fallen. The question is not whether the dollar will lose its dominance, the question is whether it happens over 20 years or over 5. And the war that nobody voted for just shortened that timeline dramatically. Number 8. 70,000 factories have closed since 1998, and America can no longer build the things it needs to survive. In 1945, more steel was produced in the state of Pennsylvania alone than in Germany and Japan combined. Let that sink in for a second. One state, more output than 2 of the most industrialized nations on Earth put together. That was America. That was what this country could do. And now let me tell you what this country looks like 80 years later. Since 1998, the United States has lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and closed nearly 70,000 factories, according to a report published by Congressman Ro Khanna in Foreign Affairs. 70,000 factories, gone. Not upgraded, not modernized, closed, the doors locked, the equipment auctioned off, the parking lots empty, the towns that depended on them hollowed out into what we now politely call the Rust Belt, but what historians will more accurately call the wreckage of a former superpower's productive core. Manufacturing's share of American GDP has collapsed from 27% in the mid-1960s to 12% today. Manufacturing employment has fallen from 28% of total jobs in 1960 to under 7%. Between 2000 and 2010, the United States lost 1/3 of all remaining manufacturing jobs in a single decade, which an MIT lecturer named William Bonvillian called a very tough decade and a very dramatic shift where millions of jobs just disappeared. And the trade deficit in manufactured goods tells the real story. In 1980, the U.S. manufacturing trade deficit was $25 billion. By 2020, it had exploded to $922 billion. We went from the country that built everything the world needed to the country that buys almost everything it needs from somewhere else. And the surplus in services, which is what economists always point to as the replacement, grew from only $6 billion to $245 billion over the same period. That $245 billion service surplus does not come close to replacing the $922 billion manufacturing deficit. The math does not work. Now here is why this matters for the empire argument specifically. Every empire that has collapsed followed the same sequence. They built their wealth through production. They expanded militarily to protect and extend that production. The military expansion became more expensive. To pay for it, they debased their currency and borrowed. To maintain profits as costs rose, they offshored production to cheaper regions. And then one day they woke up and realized they could no longer build the things they needed to defend themselves, feed themselves, or sustain their economy without depending on the very nations they were competing against. That is exactly where the United States is right now. We depend on China for 90% of rare earth processing, which is essential for every piece of advanced military technology we build. We depend on Taiwan for the most advanced semiconductor chips. We depend on India and China for the majority of our pharmaceutical ingredients. McKinsey found that while manufacturing accounts for only 11% of GDP and 8% of direct employment, it drives 20% of capital investment, 30% of productivity growth, 60% of exports, and 70% of business research and development spending. So the 12% GDP number that economists use to dismiss the decline is hiding the fact that manufacturing is the engine underneath everything else. Without it, productivity stalls, innovation slows, exports dry up, and the trade deficit widens, which is exactly what has been happening for 40 years. The Congressional Research Service reported that the U.S. share of global manufacturing activity dropped from 28% in 2002 to 16.6% by 2018. China's share went in the opposite direction, from 8.7% to 28.4%. They literally traded places. And the Senate Joint Economic Committee published an analysis saying that decades of manufacturing decline and outsourcing left U.S. supply chains vulnerable to disruption. Not might leave them vulnerable, left them vulnerable. Past tense, the damage is done. Spain offshored its production and relied on imported goods funded by New World silver. When the silver ran out, they had no productive capacity to fall back on. Britain offshored manufacturing to its colonies and dependencies. When those dependencies gained independence, the manufacturing did not come back. The pattern is identical. The US offshored its factories to China and Southeast Asia, funded the transition with cheap debt and a strong dollar, and now cannot make its own antibiotics, its own chips, or its own ammunition at the scale it needs. And the Iran war just exposed exactly how fragile that dependency is. Number 7. 722 banks reported losses exceeding 50% of their capital, and the Fed is quietly injecting billions to keep them alive. What I am about to tell you is something that is happening right now in real time, and it is being deliberately kept out of the mainstream conversation, because if the average American understood what was going on inside the banking system at this exact moment, there would be lines around the block at every branch in the country by tomorrow morning. 722 American banks have reported unrealized losses exceeding 50% of their capital. That is not a typo. 722 banks are sitting on paper losses that are greater than half of the money that is supposed to back your deposits. And the Federal Reserve just injected another $18.5 billion into the banking system through overnight repurchase agreements, which are essentially emergency short-term loans that the Fed makes to banks by buying their securities and agreeing to sell them back the next day, injecting cash to prevent a liquidity crisis. That was the fourth largest single liquidity injection since the COVID pandemic, larger than anything during the dot-com era, and you probably did not see a single headline about it. Now let me explain why this is happening, because it connects directly to the empire collapse framework. When the Fed raised interest rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023 to fight inflation, the value of bonds and securities that banks were holding plummeted. That is how bond math works. When interest rates go up, the market value of existing bonds goes down. Banks that bought U.S. Treasury bonds at 1 or 2% interest suddenly found themselves holding assets that the market valued at 30, 40, even 50% less than what they paid for them. Those losses are classified as unrealized because the banks have not sold the bonds yet. But the money is gone on paper, and if depositors started withdrawing their funds, the banks would have to sell those bonds at a loss to cover the withdrawals, which is exactly what happened to Silicon Valley Bank in March 2023. That was not an isolated event. That was a preview. And the situation has gotten worse since then, not better, because the Fed has not been able to cut rates as expected. The Iran war sent oil above $110 a barrel, reignited inflation fears, and took rate cuts completely off the table for 2026, which means the bonds sitting on those bank balance sheets are staying underwater even longer. And now layer the private credit crisis on top of that. The shadow banking market, which includes private credit funds that lend to mid-sized companies outside the traditional banking system, has grown to $1.8 trillion. And some of the biggest funds in that space have begun lowering their redemption gates, which is a polite way of saying they are restricting how much money investors can pull out. One major fund froze withdrawals entirely, and when investors cannot get their money back from private credit funds, they start pulling money from other places to cover their liquidity needs, which creates a cascade of selling pressure across the entire financial system. Jamie Dimon warned earlier this year to be prepared for something he called a cockroach event, where one institution's failure triggers a chain reaction that reveals problems hidden across the system. And Michael Burry, the investor who famously called the 2008 crash and was the subject of The Big Short, just posted a warning on Substack saying the U.S. market is like a coiled spring primed for a massive crash. His argument centers on the fact that over 60% of all equity fund assets are now in passive index funds that buy everything regardless of value. And the baby boomer generation that pumped money into those funds for decades is now hitting the age where they are legally required to start withdrawing. He projects that by 2028, mandatory withdrawals will exceed new contributions for the first time in history, meaning the engine that pumped the market up for 30 years is about to start running in reverse. And on top of that, share buybacks from major tech companies dropped 74% in Q4 2025, from $48 billion to $12.6 billion, because those companies are borrowing tens of billions to fund AI infrastructure instead of propping up their stock prices. Buybacks have been one of the primary forces holding the market up for years, and that support is evaporating at the exact moment that bank balance sheets are deteriorating. Private credit is freezing, and the largest generational wealth transfer in history is about to force selling at scale. This is what the late stage of an empire's financial system looks like. It is not a sudden crash. It is a slow bleed of confidence across interconnected institutions, each one hiding its own weakness behind accounting rules that let them call massive losses unrealized until the day they become very, very real. And 722 banks are already there. You just were not supposed to find out about it. Number 6. The Iran war has already cost more than $29 billion. Harvard says it will reach $1 trillion, and the Pentagon just asked for the largest military budget since World War II. $2 billion a day. That is what Harvard Kennedy School war budgeting expert Linda Bilmes calculated the Iran war is costing the United States every single day it continues. Not per week, not per month, per day. And by the time you finish watching this video, another $83 million will have been spent on a war that 75% of Americans opposed before it started. The Pentagon told Congress last week that Operation Epic Fury has cost $29 billion so far, up $4 billion from the $25 billion figure they disclosed just 2 weeks earlier. But congressional Democrats immediately called that number a lowball estimate that does not account for battle damage to U.S. military bases and other costs. Armed Services Committee members estimated the real figure is likely $40 to $50 billion and counting. And Professor Bilmes at Harvard calculated that the total cost of this war will reach at least $1 trillion when you account for munitions replacement, equipment repair, the permanent increase to the baseline defense budget, veterans' benefits and health care for decades to come, and the interest on the borrowed money used to pay for all of it. She pointed out that President George W. Bush fired his economic advisor Larry Lindsey for predicting the Iraq war might cost $200 billion. It ended up costing $5 trillion. The same pattern is playing out again. And here is the number that should make you physically ill. The U.S. fired more Patriot missiles in the first 4 days of the Iran war than it supplied to Ukraine over the past 4 years. Each Patriot missile costs $4 million, and they were being used to shoot down Iranian Shahed drones that cost less than $50,000 each. That is an 80-to-1 cost ratio. We are spending $80 to destroy $1 of enemy equipment. That is not a defense strategy. That is a bankruptcy accelerator. And now the Pentagon is asking Congress to approve a $1.5 trillion defense budget for fiscal year 2027, which is more than a 40% increase year over year. Professor Bilmes said that if enacted, that would push defense spending to levels about 20% higher than the peak reached during World War II. And once that increase is built into the baseline, it compounds. An additional $100 billion per year becomes $1 trillion over the next decade. Every single dollar of this is being borrowed. Before the war started, the U.S. was already on track for a $1.9 trillion deficit in fiscal year 2026. The national debt had already crossed $39 trillion. Interest payments alone consume 15% of the total federal budget, and we are borrowing to finance this war at the highest interest rates in 20 years, on top of the largest debt base in American history. Professor Bilmes made this point explicitly. Unlike the upfront costs, the interest costs are being passed directly to the next generation. The Small Wars Journal published an analysis calling this a condition of American strategic insolvency, defining it as a country whose simultaneous commitments in Europe, the Indo-Pacific, and the Gulf can no longer be sustained by its depleted arsenal, overstretched budget, or fractured alliances. During a NATO exercise in March 2026, an Italian destroyer withdrew mid-exercise to prepare for Iranian escalation, and a squadron of US F-35 Dallas was absent because they had been reassigned to the Gulf. Weapons deliveries to Baltic and Scandinavian NATO allies were postponed because the Iran theater consumed the inventory. The empire is writing checks its military cannot cash, and the war just proved it to every ally and adversary watching. This is stage 1 of the 7-stage collapse pattern, playing out in real time. Military overextension so severe that the institutions responsible for measuring it are using the word insolvency. And every empire that reached this point followed the same path downward. Number 5. Bankruptcy filings are surging at double-digit rates, and the economy that was supposed to be strong is cracking from the inside out. 565,759 Americans filed for bankruptcy in 2025. That is an 11% increase over 2024, and 2026 is accelerating. February 2026 individual bankruptcy filings hit 43,225, which is 13% higher than February 2025. Business bankruptcies are up 21%. And here is the number that stopped me cold when I saw it. Small business bankruptcies, the Chapter 5 filings, are up 91% from February 2025. 91%. Nearly double. In 1 year. That is not a soft landing. That is not a cooling economy. Finding its equilibrium. That is the foundation cracking underneath the people who build everything in this country. And the credit data tells you exactly why. 111 million Americans are carrying a credit card balance every month according to an analysis from the Century Foundation and Protect Borrowers. That is 40% of all U.S. adults who cannot pay off their credit cards. More than 27 million of them can only afford to make minimum payments. And a growing share of families are maxing out their cards, opening new accounts, or turning to payday loans and buy now, pay later services, which is the financial equivalent of setting your house on fire to stay warm. Credit card interest rates are averaging around 23% right now. If you are only making minimum payments at that rate, your balance is not going down. It is compounding against you every single month. You are paying to tread water while the current gets stronger, and the delinquency numbers confirm the wall has been hit. The New York Fed data shows 4.8% of all outstanding household debt is now delinquent. Subprime auto delinquencies hit 6.65%, according to Fitch Ratings, which is the highest level ever recorded since they started tracking it in the early 1990s, higher than 2008, and auto loans are historically the last payment Americans miss because you need your car to get to work. When people are defaulting on car payments at record rates, they have already defaulted on everything else. Credit cards, medical bills, utilities, all of it went before the car payment. And the car payment is now falling too. Consumer bankruptcies in February 2026 are running at 13% above last year, before the effects of the government disruption or the Iran war have fully shown up in the data. That means the surge you are seeing right now is from the pressure that existed before the war started. The war's impact on gas prices, grocery prices, energy bills, and interest rates has not yet cycled through into the bankruptcy filings. When it does, and it will start showing up in the Q2 and Q3 numbers, the trajectory is going to steepen dramatically. And it is not just consumers. The $1.8 trillion private credit market that we talked about earlier is directly connected to small and mid-sized businesses. When those credit funds freeze withdrawals and tighten lending, the companies that depend on that funding lose access to the capital they need to operate. They cannot make payroll. They cannot restock inventory. They cannot service their own debt, and they file for bankruptcy. That 91% surge in small business Chapter 5 filings is the early signal of a credit contraction that has not hit Main Street yet, but is heading there at speed. Every empire in the 7-stage pattern reaches a point where the financial system that sustained its expansion begins consuming itself. Debt that was taken on to grow the economy becomes debt that is taken on to service previous debt. Interest payments crowd out productive investment. Businesses that were viable under low interest rates become unviable under high ones. And the people at the bottom, the workers and the small business owners and the families running on fumes, they are the first ones the system ejects. That is what bankruptcy filings measure. They measure the number of people the system has decided it no longer needs. And that number is surging. Number 4, AI is about to eliminate millions of jobs, and nobody in power has a plan for what happens to the people who lose them. A Microsoft executive told a room full of people last month that in the next 3 to 5 years, most of his own leadership team will be out of a job. Not factory workers, not call center employees, not truck drivers. Microsoft executives, the people at the top of one of the most powerful technology companies on earth, are telling their own colleagues that the machines they are building will replace them within a presidential term. And if you think that sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, let me walk you through what is already happening right now in the real economy. Amazon laid off 16,000 corporate employees in a single day, not warehouse workers. Corporate staff, IT, AWS, human resources. One woman who had been with the company said they immediately deactivated her badge, locked her out of her computer, Slack, email, everything gone, like she did not even exist. A software QA manager with 30 years of experience said publicly that for the first time in his entire career, he is nervous because he no longer has to code. He talks to his AI-powered IDE, and it does everything from start to finish. He does not analyze tickets. He does not create test cases. He does not write a single line. He just prompts. And he said that out loud. The person who still has the job is telling you the job no longer requires a human. A doctor at UCSF was let go along with colleagues, despite the department having a 3-month patient wait. Thousands of VA doctors and nurses were also terminated. She said on camera that she is not worried about finding another job. She is worried about our collective future. And someone who was laid off from a corporate position making $200,000 a year broke down the 4 stages of AI that most people do not understand. Stage 1 is generative AI, your ChatGPT, basic input and output. Stage 2 is agentic AI, which can replicate everything you do at your desk. This is what is eliminating jobs right now. Stage 3 is artificial general intelligence, which can think, predict, and execute independently. And he said from being in meetings at that level, this technology already exists but is not available to the public. Stage 4 is superintelligence. And the gap between Stage 2, which is already here, and stage 4 is closing faster than any government regulatory framework can keep up with. Gallup estimated that diminished productivity from poor mental health costs the global economy $438 billion per year. But AI is not fixing the mental health problem. It is creating a new one. Because the psychological damage of losing your job to a machine that does not need sleep, does not need benefits, does not need a lunch break, and does not have a family to feed, that is a category of despair that no economy in history has ever had to process at this scale. And here is how this connects to the empire argument in a way that almost nobody is talking about. Every previous empire collapsed in part because of a loss of productive capacity, stage 4 in the 7-stage pattern. The US already lost its manufacturing base to offshoring. Now it is about to lose its service economy to artificial intelligence. And the service economy is what replaced manufacturing. It is 80% of GDP. It is where the middle class went when the factories closed. And if AI guts the service economy the way offshoring gutted manufacturing, there is nowhere left to go. There is no stage 3 economy waiting in the wings. Retail, finance, legal, medical, software, logistics, customer service, human resources, marketing, accounting, all of it is exposed. A man who was in meetings at major technology companies said something that I need you to take seriously. He said the plan is to eliminate the middle class entirely, to push the wealth gap so wide that there are only 2 classes left, the ownership class and everyone else. And whether you believe that is a deliberate conspiracy or simply the inevitable outcome of unchecked technological disruption does not matter. The result is the same. Millions of people are about to lose their livelihoods in the fastest economic transformation in human history. And the government that is supposed to protect them just proposed spending $1.5 trillion on the military while cutting food assistance for the poor. That is not a country preparing for the future. That is an empire consuming the last of its resources before the lights go out. Number 3. Stagflation is here. The Fed is trapped. And the playbook that saved America last time required crashing the entire economy on purpose. 49%. That is the probability that Moody's AI-driven model is currently assigning to a U.S. recession in 2026, 1 percentage point below the threshold that has preceded every single U.S. recession in the past 80 years. Goldman Sachs has raised their estimate to 30%. EY Parthenon sits at 40%. HSBC's market-implied probability jumped to 35%. And prediction markets have surged from 20% to 38% since the war began. But here is the thing that is worse than a recession. What economists are actually afraid of is not a recession. It is stagflation. And if you do not know what that word means, you need to learn it right now because it is about to become the most important word in your financial life for the next 2 to 3 years. Stagflation is when inflation stays high at the same time the economy slows down and unemployment rises. In a normal recession, the playbook is simple. The Fed cuts interest rates, borrowing gets cheaper, businesses invest, consumers spend, and the economy recovers. That playbook has worked for 80 years. Stagflation breaks the playbook. Because if the Fed cuts rates to help growth, inflation gets worse. And if the Fed raises rates to fight inflation, the economy crashes harder. There is no clean exit, and the Federal Reserve is currently trapped in exactly that position. They held rates steady at 3.50 to 3.75% in March because the Iran war has made the path forward impossible. Cut and you pour fuel on accelerating inflation from the oil shock. Race and you tip an economy that is already losing 92,000 jobs a month into a full-blown contraction. The CME FedWatch tool now shows greater than 50% probability of a rate hike, not a cut, which is a stunning reversal from the rate cut expectations that dominated just weeks ago. And the OECD has revised its U.S. inflation forecast upward to 4.2%, driven almost entirely by the energy shock. J.P. Morgan's Joseph Lupton said the war threatens to choke off a recovery and warned that a nascent recovery is now at risk because a military war layered on top of the ongoing trade war could reignite concerns over global stability. Deutsche Bank and Oxford Economics ran a simulation assuming Brent crude hits $140 per barrel for 8 weeks and found it would produce mild contractions across the developed world and push the U.S. toward a temporary standstill with layoffs driving unemployment sharply higher. And every $10 increase in oil shaves 0.2 to 0.3% from GDP while adding 0.4% to inflation. Oil went from $70 to $110 in 3 weeks. That is a $40 move. Do the math. The last time America faced genuine stagflation was the 1970s. The 1973 OPEC oil embargo shut down supply, inflation hit 12%, unemployment spiked, GDP contracted, and it took Federal Reserve Chair Paul Volcker hiking interest rates to 20% to break the cycle. 20%. That cure caused one of the deepest recessions in modern American history. Millions lost their jobs, businesses collapsed, homeowners were destroyed, and the trigger for that crisis was the exact same thing happening right now. A geopolitical closure of a critical oil choke point in the Middle East, the 1973 embargo, the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the 2008 oil spike. Every major oil shock in the last half-century has been followed by some form of recession or worse, and the current disruption, with combined oil production across Kuwait, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE dropping by at least 10 million barrels per day, is being described as the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. That sentence does not get used lightly, and the last time it applied, it took crashing the entire economy on purpose to fix it. Now ask yourself whether you think the current political leadership has the discipline and the public support to do what Volcker did. And if they do not, then the inflation does not get broken. It persists. It compounds. And the slow-motion collapse of your purchasing power becomes the permanent new reality. Number 2. Every empire believed it was the exception. Spain said it, Britain said it, the Soviet Union said it. They were all wrong. Rome minted the denarius in nearly pure silver. By the time the empire fell, the coin contained 5% silver. The Romans did not wake up one morning and decide to destroy their currency. They shaved it down one fraction at a time, over centuries, to pay for military campaigns they could no longer afford. And at every stage, the people in charge assured the public that the currency was sound, that the empire was strong, that the setbacks were temporary. The public believed them until the day the coins bought nothing, and the legions could not be paid. Spain controlled half the world's gold and silver in the 1500s. Their currency was accepted everywhere. Their military dominated Europe. Their empire was the richest the world had ever seen. And within 80 years, they declared bankruptcy 4 times. Their domestic industries had collapsed because easy wealth from the Americas destroyed the incentive to produce anything, and they fell into irrelevance as a global power. They believed their wealth was permanent because it seemed infinite. It was not. Britain ruled a quarter of the planet. The pound sterling was the global reserve currency. The sun never set on their empire. And within 40 years of entering World War I, the empire was gone. The pound lost reserve status at Bretton Woods. The wealth gap had widened until the top 1% owned 70% of everything. The military was stretched across theaters it could no longer sustain, and rationing, actual government-mandated rationing of food, was still in effect a full decade after World War II ended. The richest empire in the world. Rationing bread. The Soviet Union spent 15 to 20% of GDP on its military. The economy stagnated. The ruble was not trusted internationally. The oil price collapse of the 1980s destroyed what was left of their fiscal position. And from the moment the first cracks became publicly visible, the entire union dissolved in 900 days. Not 900 years. Not 900 months. 900 days. Now here is the United States of America in 2026. We are spending $892 billion on defense with a proposed increase to $1.5 trillion. We maintain 750 military bases in 80 countries. The dollar has lost 98% of its purchasing power since we left the gold standard. The national debt is $39 trillion. Interest payments consume 15% of the federal budget and are heading toward $1 trillion per year. We have lost 70,000 factories and 5 million manufacturing jobs. The dollar's share of global reserves has fallen from 73% to 54%. China has cut its treasury holdings by 45%. Foreign ownership of treasuries has dropped from above 50% to 30%. BRICS nations representing 40% of global GDP are building payment systems specifically designed to bypass the dollar. 722 banks are sitting on unrealized losses exceeding half their capital. Small business bankruptcies are up 91% in 1 year. 111 million Americans carry credit card balances every month. 53% cannot cover a $1,000 emergency. The typical working American has less than $1,000 saved for retirement. 90% of the country says we are in a mental health crisis. And we just launched a war that Harvard says will cost $1 trillion, funded entirely by borrowed money at the highest interest rates in 2 decades, on top of the largest debt base in human history. Every single marker that preceded the collapse of Spain, Britain, and the Soviet Union is present in the United States right now. Military overextension, currency debasement, a debt spiral, loss of productive capacity, social decay, and the early signs of reserve currency erosion. 5 of the 7 stages are complete. Stage 6 is underway, and every empire that reached this point believed it was the exception, that its military was too strong, that its economy was too advanced, that the old rules did not apply. Rome believed it, Spain believed it, Britain believed it, the Soviet Union believed it. They were all wrong. And the United States is currently making the exact same bet. Number 1. The empire is not falling because of an enemy. The empire is falling because of itself, and that is the part nobody wants to say. All right, here it is. Number 1. And I want to be very careful with how I say this because it is the most important thing I have ever said on this channel, and I need you to hear it the right way. The American empire is not being destroyed by China. It is not being destroyed by Iran. It is not being destroyed by BRICS or Russia or terrorism or any external enemy. The American empire is being destroyed by the American empire. Every decision that brought us to this point was made by us. The offshoring of 70,000 factories was not forced on America by a foreign power. It was a choice made by American executives to increase profit margins by moving production to countries with cheaper labor. The $39 trillion national debt was not imposed by an invader. It was accumulated by American politicians in both parties who spent more than the country earned for decades, because cutting spending loses elections and raising taxes loses donors. The debasement of the dollar was not a foreign attack. It was a domestic policy choice made when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, and every administration since has printed money to paper over problems they did not want to solve. The military overextension was not an accident. It was a deliberate strategy of maintaining 750 bases across 80 countries because projecting power was more politically rewarding than investing in the infrastructure, education, and productive capacity at home that actually makes a country strong. The healthcare system that bankrupts families with insurance was not designed by an enemy. It was designed by American insurance companies, pharmaceutical corporations, and hospital systems that spent billions lobbying Congress to keep the system exactly as profitable as it is. The housing crisis that has locked an entire generation out of homeownership was not caused by a foreign adversary. It was caused by American policy that explicitly chose to keep home values high for existing owners at the expense of everyone trying to buy. The student debt crisis was not imported. It was built by American universities that raised tuition at 4 times the rate of inflation for 40 years, while American banks happily financed the debt because federal law made it nearly impossible to discharge in bankruptcy. The wealth gap was not forced on us. It was engineered by a tax code that was rewritten over decades to tax labor at higher rates than ownership, to allow capital gains to be taxed at half the rate of wages, and to let billionaires pay a lower effective tax rate than their own secretaries. And the war with Iran that is currently accelerating every single one of these trends was not a defensive action. 75% of Americans opposed it before it started. It was a choice made by people in power, funded by borrowed money that your children will spend their careers paying back. This is the part that nobody wants to say, because it means there is no one else to blame. We did this to ourselves, not all at once, not with one decision, but across 50 years of choices that each seemed rational in isolation, but together form the exact same pattern that every collapsing empire has followed in the history of human civilization. Military overextension, currency debasement, debt spiral, loss of productive capacity, social decay, loss of reserve currency status, and collapse. We are at stage 5 heading into stage 6, and the only thing that separates the United States from every empire that completed all 7 stages is whether the people living inside of it right now, you, me, the person watching this video, choose to do something different than every population that came before us. Because the empires that fell did not fall because their people were stupid. They fell because their people were comfortable enough to ignore the warning signs until it was too late. And the warning signs are everywhere. So here is what I want you to do. First, share this video. Not for me, for the person in your life who feels like something is wrong but cannot explain why. This video is the explanation. Second, go watch the video I made called 10 Things Every American Should Do Right Now Before Prices Get Worse, because that video has the specific steps you can take to protect yourself and your family while the people in charge decide whether they are going to fix this or keep pretending nothing is happening. Third, leave a comment and tell me what you are going to do about it. Not what you wish the government would do, what you are going to do. Because the empires that survived their crises were not saved by their leaders. They were saved by their people. And right now, in this moment, You are the only variable in this equation that is not yet decided.